Peace, family. What's good, y'all? Y'all know who it is. It's Vinny L. All right, today we got a nice little presentation for y'all. I got a few things, few documents that I have that I want you guys to take a look at. All right, the first one I'm gonna go into today is our two first presidents, John Hanson and George Washington, by John W. Kavanaugh. All right, it's a very interesting book, written in the early 1900s, 1932. Very interesting. Um, as you see the contents, Nostradamus, the Muson theory argument, United States history, our first president, how to prove who was the first president, Supreme Court, 1803, the first seal, the first USA document, the constitutions, the first coins, gold and silver constitutional money. Washington calls emergency session of Congress. Congress creates the Department of State. Thomas Jefferson, first Republican. Thomas Jefferson was the first Democrat. Our first constitutions, President Lincoln's first inauguration speech, amendment to go back to first president's tax system, Hamilton's work in the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, the difference in old and new government, was our present Constitution our first or second? All foreign troops order out of USA by Hanson. All foreign flags ordered down by Hanson. Where are the flags captured at Yorktown? The darkest hour in U.S. history. How Washington was elected president. How vote was cast for president. The first electoral college. The old union gives birth to the new union. Some interesting, very interesting. Washington's farewell dinner. What rebellion to tyrant means. Washington's greatness. Euclid Aluminum. First U.S. Senate. What our first constitution gives us. June 20th. Our two first presidents. First vice president. Cambridge, Mass. First U.S. safe deposit. So this is a very interesting little pamphlet. It's not even really a book. It's only, as you see, it's only 60 pages long. It gives you the information straight out the block, and it doesn't really but I'm gonna skip over a few things. Some key things I want y'all to see though. This right here, argument. Every boy in school should be compelled to know that the Articles of Confederation was the first Constitution of the United States of America. All right, now this is key. This is the thing. This is something that's always talked about because a lot of people they misinterpret. They only go to the U.S. Constitution, the document itself. They don't necessarily refer to all other documents to see if that necessarily what they're finding or what's going on or what they're using is the full extent of what they're trying to express. A lot of people live and die. They're constitutionalists. They push for a certain law standard with the Constitution, but they necessarily don't know that there's more involved than just that one single document. The Constitution had absolutely nothing to do with the creation or naming of the United States of America. The name of the country came first, must always remain as it is, and no power on earth can ever change it. Mm. All the constitutions that will ever be adopted cannot change it. The Union came first, and all constitutions after. And if you don't think so, read Abraham Lincoln. See what he has said. Mm. All right, very interesting. So let's keep going down. I'm gonna skip a few things. All right, it's another interesting right here. The USA made the Constitution. The Constitution did not make the United States of America. Remember that. To begin the study of the basic points in the history of the United States of America is absolutely necessary before we attempt to write or argue, even in very simple form, to get thoroughly into our minds first that there are several fundamental, basic, and very important facts to get clear and understandable before we can claim any authority, in fact, to write on the subject if we are honest. Because without these very vital facts deeply set in our minds, we will start off wrong and then find ourselves engulfed in a tremendous and destructive whirlpool of misunderstanding and worthless conclusions. The first and most important fact that we must get deep down in our mind is that there was a union before there were any states. There was a union before there were any states. Interesting. What union are they talking about? Secondly, the union has never changed or ceased to exist. So this union has been ongoing before the setting of the Constitution, is what the document is saying. Thirdly, that the only change in the union was evolutionary, upward and onward for better in every step until we find first 18 states and then on up to 48. An expanding union or nation, the first ever visualized by the human family and with the immersion of all the civilized people on earth. Each state was a separate constitution, and out of the 13 original states evolved one great government over all. By this, you can see that constitutions can be changed for better at most any time, but you cannot change the name of the union under any circumstances. Hence the motto, e pluribus unum, in Latin, meaning out of many one, or out of one out of many. In our case, it means that out of many governments among the many states, we finally get one. So again, interesting how they talk about a union, though, before the creation necessarily of the states, the United States. All right, let's see. We can plainly see that the first Constitution of the United States, known as the Articles of Confederation, was no more defective than our present Constitution, under which George Washington was elected president. The change from one to the other was simply evolutionary. Let's see. One must keep this important date in mind at all times as a guide first. All the rights of the American people were secured on October 19th, 1781. October 19th, 1781. Right? This was when what? General George Washington fought the war for the Revolution and conquered the British Army at Yorktown and forced an unconditional surrender to the American people of everything the British king owned in this country, from the commander of the British Army, General Cornwallis. Okay? Next date is March 4th, 1789, the date upon the present Constitution was adopted, and the one which Washington was chosen president. All right. Our first president proven for the first time. To prove who was the first president of the USA, it is absolutely necessary to first go to the Supreme Court of the United States and find the authority of the presidents and the Great Seal in the year 1803. Thomas Jefferson was president at the time. Second, find out who the first president was that used the Great Seal, quoted by the Supreme Court for the first time. The seal is the president's kit of tools, weighs 67 pounds, costs $1,250, and consists of the base, upright crown, and dais. They were used for the first time by John Hanson, the first president of the United States of America, on September 16th, 1782. There never was any other seal, and there never will be any other. Every president was compelled to use the first president's tools, and every president down into the ages will be forced to use the same tools. There will absolutely never be any other. Third, now find the first U.S. government document ever signed by a president of the United States of America, with the Great Seal affixed to it on the very first occasion that the seal was ever used. It is U.S. government document number 1. This document you will find is a commission dated September 16th, 1782, giving George Washington, commander of the United States Army, full and absolute authority to exchange the English prisoners of war taken at Yorktown October 19th, 1781, and other places, and some 17,000 Germans and Hessians besides. Washington had to get authority from his superior, the first president of the USA, John Hanson, before he could make the exchange. Fourth, now get the resolution passed by the emergency session of Congress called by George Washington, president, on June 27, 1789. George Washington was president just 2 months. Fifth, now find what? Wait, what? George Washington was president just 2 months? Interesting. I'm not sure what they're exactly trying to say here. Fifth, uh, find Washington's letter dated July 24th, 1789, 3 months after he was inaugurated president, asking the Secretary of the old Federal Union, Charles Thompson, for the books, papers, and the Great Seal of the Federal Union. Washington was unable to sign any official papers of the U.S. government because the new or second Constitution had not provided him with tools to work with. The framers of the Constitution knew better. What is he trying to say here? All right, this is just to show. Very interesting document. Now, I'm gonna skip. This is the Great Seal we're talking about here, the first seal. All right, it must be affixed to every U.S. government document to make the paper legal and complete. All right, let's go down. George Washington writes for the Great Seal. All right, early American coins. What is a constitution? Our 4 constitutions. 4 constitutions. 9 out of every 10 people think our people had only 1 constitution. As a matter of fact, they had 4. Read President Lincoln's first inaugural speech. President Lincoln said in 1861, "The Union is perpetual. Confirmed by the history of the Union itself, the Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association. In 1774, it was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, it was further matured, and the faith of all the 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation. In 1778, and finally, in 1789, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. Lincoln did not say to form a new union or to make a new union, because he knew that there could never be done under any circumstances. That could never be done under any circumstances. Every reader of this book should have copies of the 4 constitutions as outlined by Abraham Lincoln, as they are inspiring, fascinating, and romantic to the extreme. I propose publishing the 4 constitutions complete with all the signers in 1 volume, same size as this, a very valuable book for real Americans. For real Americans. Are you a real American? All right, some more from our first 2 presidents. Great question. Without the United States, which came first? There never would have been any need of a constitution. George H. Ryden, PhD, professor of historical and political science of the University of Delaware, says, quote, "Every boy in school should know that the Articles of Confederation was the first form of government or constitution of the United States of America." End quote. Every little child does know that George Washington was elected the first president under the Constitution, but every child should know also that the Constitution was not the first Constitution of the United States of America. What had the Constitution to do with the war for independence? Nothing. What had the Constitution to do with the birth of the American flag was the stripes of red and white. It was carried over the seas to every country on earth, even Japan and China, years before anyone even dreamed of the Constitution. Woo! A successful United States government was in full force and operating with the respect and admiration of every Christian nation on earth for years and years before the Constitution was adopted. The American Revolution was fought and won at Yorktown, October 19th, 1781, and the Constitution was not adopted until March 4th, 1789, 8 years later. Don't be silly and think that the United States of America, with its marvelous work in government, had died and was buried in some historical burial ground. Our great fighters and the signers of the Declaration of Independence were very much alive and moving merrily along without any aid or assistance from the Constitution. Woo! Interesting. All right. What? The Declaration of Independence is our greatest human document. The one that we love, the one that the world loves. It is worshipped in every country on earth on July 4th of every year. Don't let anyone tell you the Constitution is better, because it is not and never will be. You can change the Constitution at any time, but the Declaration can never be changed by any moral power. It is the one rock upon which our government and Constitution stands. If it fails, everything else will fall and crumble into dust. What had the Constitution to do with the appointment of Washington as commander of the U.S. Army or Paul Jones as commander of the U.S. Navy? Not one thing. What had the Constitution to do with the treaty signed between the King of England and John Hanson, whereby the United States of America was recognized as a free and independent nation? Absolutely nothing. What had the Constitution to do with the discharges issued by President John Hanson to Generals Lafayette, Rochambeau, and many other foreign generals after the war was over, so they might return to their homes in Europe? What had General Washington to do with it? Nothing. That was the president's job. Interesting. Very interesting. Now I want to get to the end where it talks about our first 2 presidents, how Washington was elected president. Washington was not elected by a unanimous vote. He did not even receive a majority of the electoral votes cast. There were 12 candidates against him. Woo! 12? 12. Do you know who the 12 candidates against Washington were? The trouble with the vast majority of our people is they take too much for granted and so are led astray time and again. The election of George Washington as president is a very impressive example of how ignorant people can be and how utterly foolish our electoral college system is. No other nation ever adopted it because of its uselessness. You just hear what he said about the electoral college system? No other nation ever adopted it because of its uselessness. Nearly everyone believes that Washington was elected the same way that Lincoln or Woodrow Wilson was, but they make a great mistake, for not one person out of 10,000 knows just how Washington was elected. In spite of the great ignorance on the subject, you will hear people who should know better say, John Hanson was president, but he was not elected the same way George Washington was. As a matter of fact, these persons are absolutely ignorant of the knowledge concerning Washington's election. About one lawyer among thousands really knows. In the election for president, when Washington was chosen, the state of New York did not vote at all. A quarrel between the legislature and the Senate over how the electors were to be chosen was so bad that the great empire state did not vote at all. New York not voting for the Constitution was debarred from voting in the presidential election. New Hampshire had a similar quarrel. North Carolina and Rhode Island did not vote because they also refused to vote for the Constitution and were not members of the new Union. Only 10 states voted for president in this election under the Constitution of 1789, but not under our first Constitution. Most people seem to think they are smart when they talk on the subject. In doing so, they prove their ignorance regarding the true situation. A voter in that election had to have many qualifications before he could vote. A brief study will amaze you. They made it very hard indeed for an ordinary man to vote at all. Only one man out of every 100 could vote. The selection of members of Congress. Okay, let's put this into perspective. Because people always talk about, you know, how white people were on the same playing field. They try to make it seem how so-called white people were on the same playing field in the past, but we can clearly see that there was clearly a class system set up from the get. One man out of every 100 could vote. Interesting. The selection of members of Congress was left to the people. Under the Constitution, any man who could vote for a member of the lower branch voted also for a member of Congress. All right, let's go down. I want to get to the first House first electoral votes cast. Quick little chart. Any man who makes a statement that he knows how George Washington was elected president must be out of his mind unless he has the above figures. I present the votes as cast by the states, but not how they were cast. From Washington to Jackson, the electors were all nominated by the hand-picked method. They did the nominating by the hand-picked method. The political leaders did the nominating. Let's see. The first electoral college, the old union giving birth to the new union. Let's see. The 150th anniversary of the election of the first president of the United States of America. The old union gave birth to the new union. How the new government under the second constitution was created. How the new government under the second constitution was created. The old United States was its mother and brought it into life. It called the Constitutional Convention for that purpose of making a more perfect union. It named the day for the first meeting of the convention. It named the electors. It named the day for the selection of electors. It named the day when the more perfect union would begin to act. It named the day for electors to meet. It provided all the election appliances. It conducted the election for president under the new or second constitution. It counted the votes in the election. It issued the certificates of election to George Washington and John Adams. It notified Washington and Adams of their election. It conducted the inauguration of Washington and Adams. It conducted the election for the first U.S. senators. It inaugurated the first U.S. senators. It provided the new capital of the USA in New York City. It provided the new White House for Washington in New York City. In New York City. The old United States of America, under our first Constitution and laws, made every arrangement for bringing into life the government under our second Constitution. And there never was a question over its legality or authority to this day by anybody. If our first United States government was not lawful and legal, then positively the improved United States government under President Washington was not legal. So, bam, we're talking two separate United States. Before the Constitution of 1789, even before the Articles of Association in 1774. All right. Let's go down some more. Illegal standing of presidents. A little more stuff, just real quick. This is a very interesting document. If you ever get a chance, please, please, please delve, because you will find plenty of jewels. All right, I think this is it right here. Our first two presidents. All right. How strange is destiny to have guided these two lovable characters from boyhood to become our two first presidents. Once a great fighter on the inside fighting the enemies of the Union, and the other fighting on the outside against the British enemies, both fighting for the same cause from two opposite directions. If either of them had fallen in their fight, our Union would have fallen. But thanks to some guiding force, neither of these great fighters made any mistakes, and both won a marvelous victory for all humanity. John Hanson was old enough to be Washington's father. His oldest son was Washington's secretary for 8 years, and Washington would not think of doing anything of importance without first consulting his trusted friend. They lived opposite each other on the banks of the Potomac River, one in Virginia, the other in Maryland. They were always going into the homes of each other. They were like two women. When they met, they would put their arms around each other in a fond embrace. In boyhood, they were close to each other, and the greatest friendship continued to the last. The faces of both men show a strong Nordic type, small bones in their faces like women, although they were large physically. This shows the strange feminine characteristics which all the really great international characters took from their wonderful mothers, proving beyond doubt that all really great characters come into the world through great mothers, and not great fathers, for no great man has ever produced a really great son. It's the great mothers we must look to. Solomon proved this. Try he would, he could not produce a great son. Abraham Lincoln and Marconi proved this. Mm, mm. I don't know how many people may feel about that. It was the influence of Washington that made Congress appoint John Hanson of the Chief in the manufacturing of munitions of war and with the absolute distribution of same in 1775. Hanson was the only man Washington would trust with his most important post, and Hanson never failed him once. No two men ever loved one another more than did John Hanson and George Washington. There was a friendship like that of the lowly Nazarene and the Apostle John. Both men had very strong feminine characters, but not observable to the ordinary person. Men with these rare feminine traits, not sex, have always proven very exceptional guardians over the human family, and are the men upon whom trust can be placed to carry out great feats or movements in the cause of mankind. Yeah, I'm not trying to talk about his face. Nothing against Washington's face. Very first U.S. safe deposit. Yes, all right, that's the end of that. All right, but that's the end of that. I wanted to show you that just to give you an idea of the situation we're in, talking about lack of knowledge. Essentially, we're looking at a situation where literally, you know, people they don't know these basic facts. This is 1932. This is 1932 that this was written, and that this brother's dropping this information. Price $1. You know, so don't tell me you can't afford it. All right, next I got this one. I got this right here is the 1928 U.S. War Department Army Training Manual. All right, I've been seeing this online everywhere, so I had to introduce this information to the people, just if they, for FYI, need to know basis. All right, essentially, it gives you a how-to of how to be an American: citizenship training, individual initiative, yada yada. But there's a few areas where the information is very, very integral. Here's the course of instruction. You have the American citizen, independent relations, great Americans and their achievements, liberty and independence, purpose of government, representative government, personal responsibility, self-preservation, the American flag. I'm looking for representative government. United States. All right, going on. Good. Oh wait, no, I'm hitting the bottom, y'all. I'm sorry. Excuse me. All right. Quality of condition, government, individual initiative, development. Now, as you see, this document goes very in depth on just about everything on a need to know basis. United States, again, great people, government, entities, how it works. How essentially to become an American citizen. This would be the golden goose document for anyone who was looking for that. All right, sorry. All right, I'm gonna come back to this in a sec. But before I find this, yeah, 'cause I'm not seeing it on my first go through. Alright, here we go. Now, massive individual ego, individuality, initiative, liberty and independence. Here we go. The purpose of government. Now, in this, they also talk about types of government, the different types of government. Very interesting. Here we have early forms of government. Until the 18th century, the world had little experience with republics. In the ancient world, Greece and Rome furnished early examples of attempts to form democratic governments. In Grecian cities, popular government was practiced, the free people directly making the laws. In Rome, the townsmen passed laws to his own advantage, and in the so-called Venetian Republic, the power was vested in a few nobles. After the failure of many experiments of free government, the ancient world turned to monarchy, believing that the people were unfit to govern themselves. For centuries, political revolutions were struggles for better government rather than self-government. At the time of the Revolutionary War, the republican form of government was discredited throughout the world, monarchy and oligarchy being considered the proper forms of good government. All right. So this is at the time of the Revolutionary War. Republican government was discredited. Monarchy and oligarchies were considered the proper forms of good government. Interesting. Representative government, the American experiment. A few races qualified themselves for self-government. To establish that form of government was a long, hard struggle which culminated in the Great American Experiment. The United States set up a distinct and different form of government, the product of distinct racial stocks and centuries spent in learning the principles and art of self-government. In practice, our form of government is the most nearly perfect in securing individual rights and ensuring the blessings of liberty. It differs from previous forms in certain vital and fundamental principles, which have come to be known as American institutions. Among these is that of self-government by representation, which is the golden mean between autocracy and democracy. All right. The following comparative analysis shows the principal characteristics of the three forms of government. Autocracy, authority is derived through heredity. People have no choice in the selection of their rulers and no voice in making of the laws. Results in arbitrariness, tyranny, and oppression. Attitude toward property is feudalistic. Attitude toward law is that the will of the ruler shall control regardless of reason or consequences. Next, you have democracy. Democracy, a government of the masses. Authority derived through mass meeting or any other form of direct expression. Results in mobocracy. Mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude toward law is that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based upon deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, and impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences. Results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, anarchy. Republic. Authority is derived through the election by the people of public officials best fitted to represent them. Attitude toward property is respect for laws and individual rights and a sensible economic procedure. Attitude toward law is the administration of justice in accord with fixed principles and established evidence with a strict regard to consequences. A great number of citizens and extent of territory may be brought within its compass. Avoids the dangerous extreme of either tyranny or mobocracy. Results in statesmanship, liberty, reason, justice, contentment, and progress. Is the standard form of government throughout the world. So this is what they're saying, essentially. Because a lot of people talk about democracy. A lot of people talk about, oh, we have to spread democracy, save this democracy. Obviously, democracy is not the answer. This 1928 training manual is telling us that the standard form of government throughout the world is a republic, and it is obviously a much better option based on the descriptions provided here. A republic is a form of government under a constitution which provides for the election of one, an executive, two, an legislative body who, working together in a representative capacity, have all the power of appointment, all power of legislation, all power to raise revenue, and appropriate expenditures, and are required to create 3, a judiciary to pass upon the justice and legality of their governmental acts and to recognize 4, certain inherent individual rights. Take away any one or more of these 4 elements and you are drifting into autocracy. Add 1 or more to these 4 elements and you are drifting into democracy. Funny, funny, funny. Very interesting. They again, the truth is given to us. Honestly, they honestly just give it to us in many ways. We just got to be patient, do the studies, proper studies, so we can find the truth. All right. Socialism, communism, anarchy. The problems of capital and labor, employer and employee cannot be solved by unrepublican methods. The suggestion of special legislation is socialistic and communistic in its theory and wholly repugnant to the American character. Socialism or communism, which negates property rights, anarchy, which negates law, the substitution of direct action for representative government, a government ownership, all should be avoided as perils that threaten the very foundation of this republic. Ignorance of citizens. Webster said on the diffusion of education among the people rests the preservation and perpetuity of our free institutions. In the early colonies, one of the first buildings to be erected was the schoolhouse. Here was laid, developed, and subsequently spread the ideals of liberty. One of the foundation stones of representative government is education. An intelligent and informed citizen is an asset to the nation. The great educational system of America makes it possible for every citizen to best fit himself for the tasks of life. In the common schools, all are taught a common language, a knowledge of American traditions, ideals, and philosophy of government. Through education, that barrier that separates the citizen from the greater enjoyment of his freedom is removed, a better understanding of American ideals is established, and the influence of subversive propaganda is in large measure destroyed. Now, we know what they're trying to say here. They're trying to play, color it with, we know how the schools really are. Let's not pretend here. All right. Very interesting. Personal responsibility. All right, I think that's all from this one. Very interesting document. Again, this is the 1928 United States Training Manual, War Department, Washington, November 30th, 1928. Number 2000-25. 2000-25. Check it out, y'all. U.S. War Department, Washington, November 30th, 1928. Now, next I have, yeah, I know y'all probably gonna like this one. They were white and they were slaves. The untold history of the enslavement of whites in early America. Now I had page 23. All right, very interesting book with some interesting information, some very crucial information, honestly. The enslavement of whites extended throughout the American colonies, and white slave labor was a crucial factor in the economic development of the colonies. Gradually, it developed into a fixed system every bit as rigid and codified as Negro slavery was to become. Negro slavery was efficiently established in colonial America because black slaves were governed, organized, and controlled by the structures and organizations that were first used to enslave and control whites. Black slaves were late corners fitted into a system already developed. White slavery was the historical base upon which Negro slavery was constructed. The important structures, labor ideologies, and social relations necessary for slavery already had been established within indentured servitude. White servitude, in many ways, came remarkably close to the ideal type of chattel slavery, which later became associated with the African experience. The practice developed and tolerated in the kidnapping of whites laid the foundation for the kidnapping of Negroes. The official papers of the white slave trade refer to adult white slaves as freight, and white child slaves were termed half freight. Like any other commodity on the shipping inventories, white human beings were seen strictly in terms of market economics by merchants. The American colonies prospered through the use of white slaves, which Virginia planter John Pory declared in 1609 were our principal, quote, our principal wealth. The white servant, a semi-slave, was more important in the 17th century than even the Negro slave in respect to both numbers and economic significance. Where mainstream history books or films touch on white slavery, it is referred to with the deceptively mild-sounding title of indentured servitude. The implication being that the enslavement of whites was not as terrible or all-encompassing as Negro slavery, but constituted instead a more benign bondage, that of servitude. Yet the terms servant and slave were often used interchangeably to refer to people whose status was clearly that of permanent lifetime enslavement. An account of the English sugar plantations in the British Museum, written circa 1660 to 1685, refers to black and white slaves as servants. The colonies were plentifully supplied with Negro and Christian servants, which are the interesting. Now, peep what they say here. The colonies were plentifully supplied with Negro and Christian servants. Peep the distinction between Negro servants and Christian servants. Implication being in religious character, right? The Christians are European Caucasian whites, obviously. Let's continue. Quote, the colonies were plentifully supplied with Negro and Christian servants, which are the nerves and sinews of a plantation. Christian was a euphemism for white. Interesting how that is set up, isn't it? In the North American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and subsequently in the United States, servant was the usual designation for a slave. Mm. The use of the word servant to describe a slave would have been very prevalent among a Bible literate people like colonial Americans, and all English translations of the Bible available at the time, from Wycliffe's to the 1611 King James Version, the word slave as it appeared in the original biblical languages was translated as servant. For example, the King James Version of Genesis 9:25 is rendered, quote, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be. The intended meaning here is clearly that of slave, and there is little doubt that in the mind of early Americans the word servant was synonymous with slave. In original documents of the white merchants who transported Negroes from Africa, the blacks were called servants. Quote, one notes that the company of royal adventurers referred to their cargo as neggers, Negro servants from Africa. The documentary record debunks the propaganda that slavery was strictly a racist operation, part of a conspiracy of white supremacy because one, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. Two, in the 17th century, slaves of both races were called servants. Three, the colonial merchants of 17th century America had no qualms about enslaving their own white kindred. It, we have to come to a realization here that a lot of what we've been told about history is not necessarily true. And that the narratives being spun here trying to set up this race narrative. I know Donald Trump is in office. I know these white people wearing "Make America Great Again" hats are making people upset. I know that stupid liberal commentaries are sparking off all types of uh, 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 just blowback because of the idiocracy that's being spewed. We need to understand the history of why this all takes place and why it's all set up the way it is. We need to come to a an educational agreement on the truth. All right. Here we go. A survey. Let's see. Whiteness and independence. The All right. This is just some more on white slaves. It's just a lot. You got Irish slaves. We know about the Irish slave legal basis and definitions. Here we go. There were four categories of status for white people in colonial America: white freemen, white freemen who owned property, white apprentices, also called indentured servants, redemptioners, and free willers, and white slaves. All right. Uh, uh, the attempt by Abbott, Emerson Smith, Gallinson, and many others to deny the existence and brutal treatment of white slaves by pretending they were mostly just indentured servants, learning a trade, regulated according to venerable medieval guild traditions of apprenticeship, runs completely counter to the documentary record. Quote, the planters did not conceive of their servants socially and emotionally as integral parts of the family or household, but instead views them as an alien commodity. Having abandoned the moral responsibility aspect of pre-capitalist ideology, masters enforced an often violent social domination of white servants by the manipulation of oppressive legal codes, transforming indentured servitude with its pre-industrial, moral, paternalistic superstructure into a market system of brutal servitude, maintained by the systematic application of legally sanctioned force and violence. Informal British and colonial custom validated the kidnapping of working-class British whites and their enslavement in the colonies under such euphemisms as servitude according to the custom. which upheld the force of verbal contracts, which shipmasters and press gangs claimed existed between them and the wretched whites they kidnapped off the streets of England and sold into colonial slavery. Geez, okay, we gotta understand that, even in the days of Europe, the average layman, guy on the street, European, necessarily found themselves in all types of totally corrupt, fraudulent situations where they would be enslaved, incarcerated, jailed, put in debtors' jail, all types of things. We know of the corruption and fraud. That corruption and fraud became an extension into the Negro slavery that we have, that created the narrative that we have today. You have to understand this. Without this information, you won't be able to have a clear understanding of how racism is treated today. All right. Let's see. More. We got slave hunting in Britain. Let's see. White children in chains. White losses in the Middle Passage higher than that of blacks. Ooh, man. This is going to set some people off. White losses in the Middle Passage higher than that of blacks. Let's read. I'm pretty fast. I can read this pretty fast. White slaves transported to the colonies suffered a staggering loss of life in the 17th and 18th century. During the voyage to America, it was customary to keep the white slaves below deck for the entire 9 to 12-week journey. A white slave would be confined to a hole not more than 16 feet long, chained with 50 other men to a board, with padlocked collars around their necks. The weeks of confinement below deck in the ship's stifling hold often resulted in outbreaks of contagious disease, which would sweep through the cargo of white freight chained in the bowels of the ship. Ships carrying white slaves to America often lost half their slaves to death. According to historian Sharon V. Selinger, quote, scattered data reveal that the mortality for white servants at certain times equaled that for black slaves in the Middle Passage, and during other periods actually exceeded the death rate for black slaves. Salinger reports a death rate of 10 to 20% over the entire 18th century for black slaves on board ships en route to America, compared with a death rate of 25% for white slaves. I mean, they're comparing apples to apples, in my opinion. But as they're trying to make the argument here that white losses is higher than that of blacks. Dulles says that whites were indiscriminately herded aboard the White Guineaman, often as many as 300 passengers on little vessels of not more than 200 tons burden, overcrowded, unsanitary. The mortality rate was sometimes as high as 50%, and young children seldom survived the horrors of a voyage which might last anywhere from 7 to 12 weeks. The mercantile forms, as importers of white servants were not too careful about their treatment, as the more important purpose of the transaction was to get ships over to South Carolina, which would carry local produce back to Europe. Consequently, the Irish, as well as others, suffered greatly. Just more to know, this is just to give you an idea of just the situation in early pre-colonial America, in colonial America, how everybody, literally anybody, could be literally put under some type of servitude experience. The African slave trade was not fully established in the early 17th century. The price of African slaves were prohibitively high, and the English were neither familiar with nor committed to black slavery as a basic institution. Ship captains involved. Let's see, you got the white slave. Let's see, white slaves sold high enough to recommend a the number of diseased white slaves arriving was high enough for Pennsylvania officials to recommend a quarantine law for them. Thus, a new torment was to be endured for white slaves who were often stopped just short of the New World with land in sight and forced to remain quarantined on board ships in which they had just spent a horrifying 10 to 12 weeks. Woo! Ships filled with diseased white slaves landed anyway. Woo! So think about it, because we know what the narrative is. The usual narrative is that when the Europeans came to the Americas, right? When the Spanish came, the Dutch, the British, the French, when they came and started enslaving, they first used the Native Americans in the plantation system. The plantation system essentially killed off the Native Americans. They either would not work or they died off. You know, knowing that they would not work or they died off, essentially they went over to using so-called Europeans to do the work. The Europeans were diseased and they died in huge rates. People like J.A. Rogers write about how women, when they came to the Americas, they would die as soon as they literally would land. They died from disease over time. They would die from all types of situations, dangerous situations involved in colonial American life. It ultimately it went to the African, the so-called Negro, where they used the Negro to work the plantation, and that's how it developed. Here, that same argument is being framed, but it's more detail is involved, and it's giving us a deeper understanding. Before 1650, the greater victims of man's inhumanity were the mass of white Christian servants who suffered at the hands of callous white Christian masters. For the time being, with all their troubles, the blacks had it better. Again, people have to they have to think Negroes almost in every instance under one comfortable circumstance, under our comfortable circumstances, than the miserable European over whom the rigid planter exercises an inflexible rigidity. They are strained to the utmost to perform the allotted labor. They frequently try to escape, but very few are successful, and when apprehended are committed to close confinement, advertised, and delivered to their respective masters. The unhappy culprit is doomed to a severe chastisement, and a prolongation of servitude is decreed. Those who survive seldom establish their residence. Mm. In the British West Indies, the torture visited upon white slaves by their masters was routine. This sounds like medieval times, right? Doesn't this sound like Middle Ages times, the Renaissance? We're talking about the times where right before the the Great Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition, right? You had these times where torture was prevalent by these noble lords and their knights. We've seen the stories, right? These stories are based on what happened in the past. We know there are plenty of times where white so-called residents would be subject to corruption, right? People would be contractual trickery, judicial malfeasance, and usury employed against them during their supposedly limited term as indentured servants. Sounds like, oh, you're a servant for a certain amount of time, but we're gonna continually add new things to the contract to keep you indentured for eternity. And it just shows you again that we have to look deeper than what just original people what people just say about certain things. All right, so I'm gonna move on from they were white and they were slaves. All right, again, I have all these documents. All right, on my Facebook. This is BK Pursuit of Enlightenment at Vinny the Moore on Facebook. But the files, if you really want the files, you're gonna have to join the original Moorish American Israelite Study Squad (ATL). We have a file folder here, and we have this file folder. We also have some other things. We talk about all types of things here. All right. Got some presentations for y'all as well. Now, to finish off, I have Final Judgment of Civil Orders. I'm going to finish off just with the introduction to the Final Judgment of Civil Orders. If you're not aware, these were the civil orders sent by the Pope, right? An example of the deception. When you applied for a marriage license, a private for-profit franchise of the United Nations doing business as state of blank claimed the custodial ownership interest in your marital relationship and the products resulting from it. On the basis of your own signature, this entity secretively claimed to own you, your wife, and your children as chattel. According to them, when you apply for a marriage license, the nature of the marriage contract changes and becomes a civil contract. Marriage is a civil contract to which there are three parties: the husband, the wife, and the state. Did you ever intend to give a foreign, privately owned corporation merely calling itself the state of blank permission to distribute your assets in a divorce, force you to pay alimony and child support, and to seize custody of your minor children under armed force? Were these results of signing a marriage license ever disclosed to you by the state? The state disclosed its identity and nature as a franchise of a foreign for-profit privately owned corporation. You were never required to have a marriage license to be lawfully married, but was that fact ever fully disclosed to you by the state? You have the absolute right to rescind your signature from any contract that was not fully disclosed to you. Such a contract is null and void as if it never existed at all, and all payments and other asset distributions exercised under it are subject to return to the lawful owner or owners plus reasonable interest. You are not obligated by any contract obtained under conditions of fraud, deceit, or non disclosure. The state is culpable for its failure to disclose. Any demand that you provide a marriage license as a prerequisite to access services and benefits to which you are otherwise entitled, such as medical insurance coverage for your spouse, are illegal monopoly inducements. This is just the tip of the iceberg. In the presence of God, Pope Francis, and the world, let it be known to all living and dead and to all those responsible for administration of the affairs of the living and dead that all commercial contracts ever actually or presentably existed between the living man known to the public as James Clinton, yada yada, and their name the states. All right, well, this is information. Basically, this is a declaration, right? This is a declaration. Privately held American Express and the following incorporated entities are all uniformly invalidated for semantic deceit and non-disclosure. Let's see. Notice of the motu proprio issued by Pope Francis, acting as trustee of the Global Estate Trust of July 11th, 2013, have been presented to all directly interested parties. What are they talking about? The motu proprio. What are they talking about? I know what we do here, man. By the Vatican. Holy See. No, that's not it. I have it. Thought I had it in my Dropbox, y'all. Thought I had it in my Dropbox, y'all. But this is not the correct document. I had the document from the Pope. Pope letter to U.S. officials. All right. Let's see. Talking about the jurisdiction. Let's see. No, it says in there that they'd have the PDF. All right. Here we go. Oh no, it's gone. I know how they do, man. Damn. Let's see. All right, okay. So I think this is the letter right here. This is Pope Francis's letter issued to all members of the domestic police forces, U.S. Marshal Service, the Provost Marshal, members of the American Bar Association, and the American Armed Services. These are organic American states of the Union. These organic American states of the Union, known as the United States of America, major, exercising plenary civil power upon the land, hereby appoint General Gordon F. Ham to lead and command the Grand Army of the Republican successors. Should it become necessary to suppress commercial mercenary forces operating under the guise of being federal government agencies, General Ham shall assume immediate command and control of armed forces and services owed to the U.S. and shall join them under his command as the Grand Army of the Republic. Let's see. So what are they saying here? President of the United States are owed any no orders, executive or otherwise, issued by Barack H. Obama pretending authority on the land of the American states while operating as President of the United States Corporation, nor as the President of the quote unquote President of the United States of America, minor, or owed any performance by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Ham, or any ordinary. All plainly stated grants of contractual authority evident in the Constitution for the United States of America remain in place, subject to good faith performance of the accompanying obligations and treaties. Mr. Obama is the president of a governmental services corporation under contract to provide stipulated services to the organic states and is on their payroll. He otherwise acts as a foreign dignitary representing the United States of America minor. In neither of these capacities is he allowed any granted authority to impose upon American state citizens, endanger American state property, or command mercenary forces on American state soil, however veiled as federal civilian service agencies. We require that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Ham to commence measures to disarm federal civilian agency personnel and to seize control of the vast stockpiles of arms which have been improperly amassed by the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and other agencies employed by the United States. All capital. Woo! I mean, it's all here, yo. It's all here. Now, this document right here, again, this is Google. I just Googled this, guys. Pope letter to U.S. officials. Lichturn.com / WP content. Right here. Binged it. I ain't even Googled it. I binged it. All right. But I'm going to drop it right here, y'all. I just wanted to bring y'all this information. I'm going to post this on my YouTube. I'm going to post this on Facebook. I'm going to also post this as a MP3 documentary as well. Because people need to understand that this information is needed on all venues. You can check me out on SoundCloud, Vinny L, at VKid_. We got Truth of the Mind with Vinny L. We out here doing big things. We got the Israelite Study Squad. If you're in the ATL area and you're trying to find people to study with, hit a brother up. We got lots of information, lots of files, lots of videos. We got things in the mix. We got things coming for y'all. All right? Y'all stay tuned. Peace and love to the family. Y'all show love. Y'all be safe out here. There be gun shootings, gun violence. Y'all stay safe. Be blessed.